Archive 13, The Underground Empire, The Case of Alexander Nikolayevich Komin. Introduction. A single bulb hung from a wire above a concrete floor in Vyatskia Polyani. It swung when the ventilation kicked on. It swung when the door opened. It swung when someone cried hard enough to shake the bench. 5 women sat at sewing machines bolted to wooden planks. Their fingers moved through leather and thread with the mechanical precision of people who had learned that stopping meant punishment. Against the far wall, in a wooden chair that had once belonged in someone's kitchen, sat Alexander Nikolayevich Komin. He held a notebook. He was writing down numbers, hours worked, rations issued, shortfalls noted. The basement measured 12 meters by 8. A steel door sealed the only exit. Outside that door, outside that yard, outside that ordinary-looking shed with weeds growing from its foundation, the town of Vyatskia Polyani continued its daily life. Factory shifts changed, children walked to school, market stalls opened, dogs barked at passing cars. The world did not know what existed beneath it. Komin had dug the space himself over a period of months. He poured concrete walls, he installed ventilation pipes that exited through a false shed structure, he tapped electricity from the street grid through a hidden line, he tested the chains, he measured the space a woman's arm could reach. He was thorough, he was patient, he was, by every observable measure, an ordinary man. The women slept on mattresses placed directly on the cold concrete floor. Each morning, Komin unlocked the door, descended the ladder, set down bread and water, counted the previous day's production, and locked the door again before leaving for his shift at the local plant. He was never late for work. One woman, Irina Gusiak, kept a calendar. She scratched the marks into the concrete behind her mattress using a nail she had worked loose from a bench slat, 1 mark for each day. She made the marks small, precise, the way a person makes marks when they are determined to survive long enough for them to matter. By the time police lifted the hatch in 1997, there were more than 700 marks on that wall. The archives record that Komin selected his captives from nearby villages. He offered rides. He mentioned work. He showed them the pistol only after the car was moving. He reminded them that he knew where their families lived. That last part, investigators would later note, was the most effective restraint of all. Not the chains, not the locked door, the families. The finished goods, leather belts, boots, work gloves, moved through regional markets under false names. Money returned to the bunker as flour, potatoes, thread, and occasionally a single cigarette issued as reward for exceptional output. The women produced real goods that entered the real economy. Real rubles changed hands at real market stalls. No one asked questions about the supplier. The first body surfaced in a shallow grave near the Vyatka River. Investigators traced fibers from the burial clothing back to specific machines in the basement. When officers finally opened the hatch, 3 women were still seated at their benches, still chained at the ankle, still working. Komin had fled hours before they arrived. He was captured 2 days later at a bus station in Kirov with a one-way ticket in his hand and a list of names in his pocket. The names belonged to the families of the women in the bunker. He offered no resistance at arrest. He asked only one question during transport. He asked whether the women were still alive. The officer who answered him later said he wished he had stayed silent. This is Archive 13. These files are real. Every name in this record was a person who woke up one morning not knowing it would be their last ordinary day. We open these files because silence is how the door stays locked. Subscribe to Archive 13 and tell us in the comments how many more basements remain sealed in Vyatskia Polyani. She was 26 years old and she was running late. Valentina Sorokina stood at the bus stop on the eastern edge of Vyatskia Polyani in the spring of 1995 with a small canvas bag at her feet and the particular patience of someone who has learned that rural buses operate on their own calendar. She had a sister in the next town. She was going to visit for 2 days. She had made a plum cake the evening before and wrapped it in cloth and put it in the bag. Investigators recovered the cloth. The cake was never mentioned in the records again. Alexander Komin pulled his car to the curb and rolled down the window. He was 41 years old, medium height, a forgettable face. He wore the kind of jacket that workers wore at the plant. He mentioned sewing work. Daily pay, he said. Good money for the region. He said he was heading that direction anyway. It was no trouble. Valentina Sorokina got into the car. She had no reason not to. This is important to hold on to, because the mind wants to find the error in judgment, wants to locate the moment where she should have known. There was no such moment. He was plausible. He was ordinary.
He looked like a man offering a ride.
The pistol appeared after the first turn away from the main road. He drove directly to the yard on Ulica Lenina. He pulled into the shed. He told her to be quiet and to think about her family before she decided to make noise. He lifted the hatch in the floor. The smell of fresh concrete rose from below. Forensic psychologist Dr. Anna Portova, writing in the 2001 Journal of Forensic Psychiatry, noted that Komin's selection method was consistent with what profilers term the provider lure, an offer of legitimate work or transport that exploits economic vulnerability rather than physical force as the primary instrument of capture. In post-Soviet rural Russia of the mid-1990s, where factory closures had devastated local economies and legitimate work offers from strangers were not uncommon, this method carried a statistical probability of acceptance significantly higher than direct confrontation. In other words, the poverty of the region was load-bearing infrastructure for what Komin built underground. The archives record Valentina Sorokina's first night in the bunker with clinical brevity. She was chained to a bench. She was shown the machine. She was given a piece of bread. The door was closed. She later told investigators that the sound of the welding torch sealing the exterior latch from above was the sound she heard in her sleep for years afterward. She also told them something else. She said that in the first hours, before the other women woke, she sat in the dark and held her canvas bag and counted the things inside it by touch: a change of clothes, a bar of soap, the wrapped cloth that had held the cake. She counted them the way a child counts objects to stay calm. She counted them until morning. Valentina Sorokina was not a victim type. She was a woman who made plum cake for her sister and got into the wrong car. Myth versus reality. Popular accounts of abduction cases often describe victims as having ignored warning signs or made visible errors in judgment. The reality documented in the Komin case files is precisely the opposite. Investigators noted that every woman Komin selected had been chosen for her isolation at the moment of approach, alone, in transit, at a predictable location. He observed before he acted. The selection was his. The vulnerability was manufactured by circumstance, not personal failure. Every woman in that bunker made a rational decision with the information available to her. The information Komin gave them was false. The smell of fresh concrete stayed in Valentina's clothes for 3 weeks. She mentioned this in her statement to investigators 4 times. Some details lodge in the body and refuse to leave. A chain is a simple thing. It has no psychology. It requires no explanation. It does not negotiate. Komin had installed the collar system during the same construction phase as the ventilation and the electrical line. The collars were steel, padded with a strip of leather. He had cut the leather himself from workshop scrap so that they did not break the skin quickly. Broken skin became infection. Infection reduced productivity. He had thought this through. Each collar was connected by a length of chain to a bolt set in the concrete floor beside each bench. The chains were measured to allow movement between the sewing machine and the bucket latrine in the corner. Komin had tested the lengths himself, walking the arc, checking that a woman of average height could reach both points without having to drag the full weight of the chain. He was, in the language of systems engineers, optimizing for throughput. The control structure had 3 components. The chain prevented physical escape, the threat against families prevented screaming, signaling, and coordinated resistance. The food rationing system prevented the formation of will. That last mechanism was the most sophisticated. Each evening, Komin descended into the bunker with the day's production count. He compared it against the quota written in his notebook. Any shortfall, 3 pieces, 5 pieces, 10 pieces, was deducted from the following day's food allocation, not from the individual who had fallen short, from all of them. He distributed hunger collectively. The women policed each other. He had designed it that way. Fact: Dr. Yuri Antonian, a criminologist whose 2003 study on coercive labor systems in post-Soviet states was cited during appeals proceedings, described Komin's food rationing system as a near textbook implementation of operant conditioning under deprivation conditions. The collective punishment structure, Antonian wrote, is not accidental. It is the most efficient method available to a single controller managing multiple captives without physical assistance. It converts the group into its own enforcement mechanism. Komin never needed a second guard. He had built one from hunger and shared consequence. The cigarettes were part of the system too. Once a week, sometimes less, he brought a partial pack of cigarettes into the bunker. He gave one cigarette to the woman who had produced the highest count for the week. He did this in front of the others. The woman who received it smoked it at her bench, in full view of the group, while the machines ran. The other women did not resent her. They watched her the way people watch a fire. For warmth they cannot quite reach. They resolved to produce more next week. Komin recorded the weekly cigarette issuance in his ledger, the same way he recorded thread consumption. He had reduced 5 human beings to line items in an accounting system, and the accounting system worked. No one spoke above a whisper after the first week. This is in the testimony. Multiple women, interviewed separately, recalled the same threshold, the first week and then silence.
Komin had not commanded silence.
He had not punished speaking. The whisper had arrived on its own, the way that cold arrives in a room when the heat has been off long enough. The body learns the rules of the space it inhabits. They were not broken. They were adapting. Adaptation is what humans do when breaking is the only alternative, and these women had decided, each in her own way and without speaking of it, that they were not going to break. Irina Gusiak kept her nail behind the loose slat. Valentina Sorokina counted objects by touch in the dark. The others developed their own private systems of preservation, small rituals, tiny anchors to the person they had been before the hatch opened. Komin saw none of this. He saw the finished count at the end of the day and wrote it in his notebook and locked the door when he left. He thought he understood everything happening in that basement. He understood nothing that mattered. Twice a week, on Tuesday and Saturday mornings, Alexander Komin loaded his van. He used the loading door on the side of the shed, the side not visible from the street, and worked methodically, the way a man works when the task is familiar. Leather belts in one stack, wrapped in brown paper. Work gloves in another. Boots, when there were enough, in a third. He arranged the packages against the van walls with the unhurried precision of a man who has done this many times and never been in a hurry about it. The van was unremarkable. A dented gray panel model, common enough in the Kirov region that it registered as background, the visual equivalent of ambient noise. No one remembered it at the markets. This was intentional. The markets were in Kirov, 60 kilometers northeast. He took different routes on different days. Not always. Not with any rigid schedule that might suggest he was hiding something. Just variation, the way a man varies his routine out of mild boredom. He arrived when the morning stalls were setting up, before the crowds arrived, and he took a position near the back where foot traffic was lighter and browsers moved quickly. He used the name Volkov at the market on Prospect Lenina. At the weekend market near the train station, he used Petrov. Both names appeared on handwritten sales receipts that he kept in a tin box under the driver's seat. Investigators found 47 receipts across a span of 22 months. The math of them is quiet and devastating. 47 market runs, hundreds of transactions, every one of them conducted in full public view, in daylight, with other vendors and customers within arm's reach. No one asked where the goods came from. The leather goods Komin sold were, by all surviving market records and the testimony of regular vendors at both locations, considered good quality. One vendor who sold adjacent to him for several months told investigators he had assumed Komin sourced his stock from a small workshop, possibly family-run, which operated at margins too thin for formal registration. This was not unusual in the regional market economy of 1996. The goods were real, the craftsmanship was genuine. It is documented in the court records that at least one pair of boots sold at the Kirov market was purchased by a local police officer. He wore them to work. The money Komin took home was modest. His ledgers, those careful, meticulous ledgers that investigators later described as the most complete financial record of a criminal enterprise they had encountered in years, showed no large deposits, no suspicious accumulations. He spent what he made. Flour, potatoes, cabbage, thread in 4 weights, machine oil for the mechanisms, bread in specific quantities calibrated to the number of women currently operational. That was the word his ledgers used. Operational. The women who had died were listed with a date and the notation, no longer operational. The women who remained were listed with their daily output. He had given them numbers, not names, not even the abbreviated surnames the official records used. Numbers. 5 numbers sat in a basement and sewed leather goods that strangers bought with honest money and wore on their honest bodies and never once wondered about. Myth versus reality. A persistent assumption in coverage of forced labor cases is that such operations necessarily involve visible signs of distress in the goods produced, deliberate flaws sewn into seams, hidden messages, irregular patterns that a sharp-eyed observer might notice and investigate. The reality documented in the Komin files is that the goods were consistently well made, with no detectable anomalies. Forensic textile analysts examined recovered samples during the 1999 trial. Their conclusion was that the stitching was uniform, the measurements accurate, the finishing work professionally executed. The women were skilled. They had brought skill to this place, and Komin had put it to use. There were no hidden messages. There was no way to send one. The only record the women kept was Irina Gusiak's calendar, scratched into concrete where no market customer would ever see it. At the Tuesday market, he usually ate lunch at a stall near the main entrance. A bowl of soup, sometimes bread. He paid. He thanked the vendor. He drove home and unlocked the hatch and descended to count the morning's production. On at least 12 occasions documented in the receipts, he made these market runs while simultaneously one of the women in the bunker was actively ill. He sold gloves stitched by hands running a fever. He made change and pocketed rubles while women sat in a sealed concrete room 60 kilometers away and measured time by the swinging of a single bulb. The soup at the market, a regular vendor told investigators, was usually cabbage. He always finished it. Dr. Alexander Bukhanovsky, the Rostov-based criminologist who had previously consulted on the Chikatilo case and who reviewed the Komin files at the request of the prosecution, wrote in his 2001 analysis, "What distinguishes Komin from disorganized offenders is precisely this capacity for sustained compartmentalization. The market runs are not evidence of recklessness. They are evidence of a mind that had constructed an internal architecture in which 2 entirely separate realities coexisted without friction. He was not suppressing guilt during those market runs. He experienced no guilt to suppress. The basement was, in his cognitive framework, a workplace. He was going to the other workplace. This is a pattern we identify in organized predatory personalities, not the inability to feel, but the absence of the wiring that connects action to consequence in the moral register. He drove the same road both ways. He never once pulled over. The last market run in the records is dated 11 days before the hatch was opened. He sold 2 belts and a pair of work gloves. The buyer was a farmer from a village outside Kirov. The farmer still has the gloves. He was informed of their origin by journalists in 2000. He declined to comment further. Her name was Lyudmila Petrenko. She was 31 years old. Before the car and the pistol and the hatch, she had worked at a textile factory in Malmizh, 30 kilometers south, where she operated a commercial sewing machine for 8 hours a day and walked home in the evenings to an apartment she shared with her younger brother. She was good at the machines. She had been good at machines her whole working life. That skill was part of why Komin had selected her. She was also, by the testimony of the surviving women, the one who fought the longest to find a physical solution to the chains. She had found the spoon, or rather, she had manufactured it. Bending a strip of metal, she had worked free from a broken machine component over a period of several weeks, pressing it flat against the concrete edge of her bench when Komin was not in the room, hiding it in the hem of her mattress cover at night. The women knew about the spoon. No one spoke of it. Some watched in their peripheral vision while they sewed. She had been working on the collar for 3 weeks before the marks became visible. Forensic metallurgist testimony at the 1999 trial established that the collar had been abraded at a specific joint on the interior circumference, the point of maximum stress when the collar was rotated. This was not random scratching. It was methodical material analysis conducted without tools, by hand, in poor light, over weeks. The metallurgist described it as evidence of significant mechanical intelligence applied under extreme constraint. Lyudmila Petrenko had been in effect, reverse engineering her own restraint. She came within 4 millimeters. Komin discovered the marks on a Tuesday morning during his routine inspection of the collars, which he conducted every 3 to 4 days. The inspection took him 30 seconds per collar. He ran his thumb around the interior circumference of each one, feeling for scratches or stress marks. He had designed this inspection into his routine from the beginning. He had anticipated that someone would try. He did not raise his voice when he found the marks. Multiple women's testimonies confirm this. He simply stopped. He looked at the collar. He looked at Lyudmila Petrenko. He set down the bread he had been carrying. Then he unlocked her from the bench and told her to stand against the wall. She stood for 2 days. No food, no water. The chain still connected her collar to a bolt in the wall so that she could not sit or lie down without choking herself. The other women sewed. The machines ran. The bulb swung. The sound of the machines during those 2 days, the women have described it in separate testimonies, using almost identical language, became a kind of unbearable sound, a sound they sewed through because stopping meant they would hear themselves breathing, and hearing themselves breathe meant thinking about Lyudmila Petrenko 2 meters away. On the 3rd morning, she collapsed. The autopsy, conducted in 1997 when her remains were exhumed from the riverbank grave, listed the cause of death as dehydration, compounded by blunt force trauma to the posterior skull, a finding consistent with a fall against a concrete surface, or with a strike from a blunt object, or with both. The forensic language is careful. It declines to specify which. Komin buried her body 2 kilometers away, in soft ground near the Vyatka River. He used the same shovel he had used to pour the bunker foundation. The work took him less than an hour. He returned to the yard, washed the shovel, and put it back in the shed. The following morning, he descended into the bunker, set down the bread and water, and updated the ledger. Lyudmila Petrenko's number was crossed out. Beside it, in his careful handwriting, a date and a single word, closed. She had been 4 millimeters from getting out. The surviving women were not told explicitly what had happened to her. They did not need to be. They had been in the room. They had heard the sound of the shovel, carried faint through the ventilation pipe on a still night. Or perhaps they had not heard it at all and only believed afterward that they had. The way the mind reconstructs evidence to fit the knowledge it later acquires. What they knew, without being told, was that she was not coming back. And what Komin knew, without examining it too closely, was that the lesson had been received. No one touched the collars again, not with a bent strip of metal, not with fingernails, not for a long time. Myth versus reality. In post-trial commentary, several observers suggested that the surviving women's failure to mount a coordinated resistance after Lyudmila Petrenko's death indicated psychological passivity or learned helplessness. The testimony record does not support this reading. What the record shows is strategic patience, women who had observed precisely what resistance cost and who made a calculated decision to survive long enough for another opportunity. Irina Gusiak resumed marking her calendar the day after Lyudmila Petrenko was removed from the bunker. She did not stop until the hatch opened. This is not passivity. This is a woman keeping count. The cold came up through the concrete floor even in August. This is in the testimony. Multiple women, interviewed separately, mentioned the floor first, before the machines, before the collar, before the food. The floor. The specific quality of cold that concrete holds in its bones regardless of season, the kind of cold that moves through the body slowly, starting at the soles and working upward through the hours, so that by the time Komin opened the door each morning, the women had already spent 2 hours awake, pressing their feet against the machine bases for the warmth the motors threw off during the night cycle. They had learned to wake early enough to do this. The machines held heat for several hours after shutdown. The women had mapped this precisely. The way people map all the resources available in a confined space. Completely, obsessively, because in a confined space, every degree of warmth is the difference between sleeping and not sleeping, and sleep was the only place Komin could not follow them. Irina Gusiak was 34 years old when Komin put her in the bunker. She had a daughter named Masha, 9 years old, who lived with Irina's mother in Vyatsky Polyany while Irina worked. Investigators found this in the initial missing person report filed by her mother 11 days after Irina failed to come home. 11 days. The delay is explained in the report. Irina had mentioned, vaguely, that there might be temporary work in Kirov. Her mother had waited for a call that did not come. The thread around Irina's wrist had come from a small sewing project Masha had been working on at school. A friendship bracelet, the kind children make, wound from leftover thread in whatever colors are available. Masha had given it to her mother on a Sunday. The following Thursday, Irina Gusiak accepted a ride from Alexander Komin. She was still wearing the bracelet when officers opened the hatch in 1997. She had worn it for 2 years and 4 months. She had touched it every time she heard the hatch mechanism engage, twice a day, minimum, for more than 800 days. The archives are silent on whether she ever spoke her daughter's name aloud in the bunker. Her testimony from the weeks following rescue does not include the word Masha in any recorded statement. Child Protective Services records from the same period, partially accessible through later appeals proceedings, indicate that mother and daughter were reunited approximately 6 weeks after the hatch was opened. What happened in that room when they saw each other is not in the record. Some things belong to the people they happened to, and to no archive. The other confirmed survivors were Natalia Voronova, 28, who had been a shop assistant in Kirov before her abduction, and a woman identified in court documents only as Olga M., age approximately 35, whose full name was withheld at her request. A fourth woman whose name the archives record as Elena Baikova, 22, a student who had been traveling between towns for a summer job interview, is mentioned in early investigation notes and then absent from later records. Her status is listed in a closed file. Each of these women had a life before the bunker, a room somewhere, objects they had handled enough times to know by touch, a particular way they made tea or folded laundry or said goodnight. These things did not disappear when the hatch closed. They persisted, fragile and precise, in memory, and the women tended to them the way you tend a small fire in a large wind, carefully, with both hands, refusing to let it go out. Natalia Voronova memorized poetry in the bunker. She had known poems before, schoolroom poems, the kind everyone knows, and in the first weeks he recited them silently at the machine, her lips moving slightly, her hands continuing to work. When she ran out of poems she knew completely, she began constructing her own, working with the fragments she could remember, filling gaps with new lines. By the time of her rescue, she had composed, by her own estimate, 30-something poems entirely in her head, written nowhere, preserved only in the neural architecture of a woman determined to be more than the number in Komin's ledger. She was asked at the trial if she remembered any of them. She said yes. She was not asked to recite one. The court had other priorities. The sewing machines were Soviet-era industrial models. Heavy, reliable, designed for institutional settings. Their motors produced a sound described by the women as constant, not loud but pervasive, the kind of sound that fills a room so completely that its absence becomes louder than its presence. On the 2 occasions in more than 2 years when a machine broke down and Komin did not immediately fix it, the women described the silence that resulted as disturbing rather than relieving. They had begun to need the sound the way you need a heartbeat, not for pleasure, but because its stopping means something has ended. Irina Gusiak kept her nail behind the slat. She marked each day in the morning before Komin arrived in small, careful strokes that she could read and pour light by running her fingertip across them. She had, investigators noted, developed a system of grouping, 5 marks, then a space, then 5 more, so that she could count quickly. She was managing data. She was keeping records inside his records. In a place where Komin controlled everything, the calendar on the concrete wall was entirely hers. He never found it. In a town of 30,000 people, a man held women in a basement for 2 years. His neighbors knew him. Some of them liked him. He was quiet. He paid his way. He did not bother anyone. This is the chapter that should be hardest to write. It is not, because the archives are clear, and the archives tell a story that is not unusual. The house at 14 Ulitsa Lenina was a standard single-story structure of the type built across provincial Russia in the 1960s. Brick exterior, modest yard, a separate outbuilding that functioned as storage or workshop depending on the occupant. Komin had lived there since the late 1980s. Before the bunker, the shed had stored firewood and garden equipment. After the bunker, it stored firewood and garden equipment on top, and a sealed hatch beneath. The transformation took place over approximately 8 months. Komin worked on weekends, occasionally at night when the street was quiet. He removed soil in a truck he borrowed from the plant. This is in the plant records, a single loan of a utility vehicle for what was logged as yard clearance. He poured concrete in stages.
He mixed it in the yard,
Which was not unusual for a man doing home improvement in a neighborhood where home improvement was constant and largely self-performed. No one filed a complaint about the construction noise. No one remarked on it at trial. A woman identified in police records as Galina F., who lived 2 houses east, came to the local station in the spring of 1996. This is documented in the complaint log, entry number 47 for that quarter, filed on a Wednesday afternoon. She told the officer on duty that she had been hearing voices from the direction of Komin's yard at night. She described them as women's voices, she thought, though she could not be certain. Sometimes she heard what sounded like crying. She had waited weeks before coming in because she did not want to make trouble for a neighbor she had never had problems with. The officer noted the complaint. He is identified in the log by his badge number, not his name, a gap that was not resolved during the investigation. He recorded the address and the description and the complainant's name, and he closed the entry with the notation, "Resolved, verbal inquiry conducted, no further action required." There is no corresponding record of a visit to 14 Ulitsa Lenina, no door knock notation, no interview with Komin, no second entry in the log. Galina F. had given the police the location of the bunker 12 months before they found it. Myth versus reality. Post-case analysis frequently positions the failure to investigate Galina F.'s complaint as a product of corruption or deliberate concealment. The investigation into the responding officer found no evidence of bribery or contact with Komin. The more probable explanation, and the more troubling one, is simpler: institutional fatigue. The Kirov region station in 1996 was processing complaints with a staff reduced by budget cuts following the economic collapses of the early post-Soviet period. Missing persons cases, noise complaints, domestic disturbance reports, they accumulated.
priority was assigned by category.
And an unverified noise complaint from a residential address involving a neighbor with no prior record was in the triage logic of an underfunded station. Low priority. The system did not fail because someone made a corrupt decision. It failed because no one made any decision at all. The sewing machine sound. This is worth addressing directly because it appears in 3 separate neighbor statements given during the investigation, and in each case, the witness described it as something they had registered and subsequently explained to themselves without investigating further. One neighbor assumed Komin had taken on garment work from the plant, a common arrangement in the region. Another assumed a family member had moved in. A third said, simply, that she had heard it and thought nothing of it, because machines running in a yard were not unusual, and she had other things to think about. This is not a condemnation. This is the condition of ordinary life in a place where ordinary life was already difficult. The Kirov region in 1996 was a place of economic hardship, of families managing on reduced wages or no wages, of a social fabric that had been torn at the institutional level and was being held together at the neighborhood level by exactly the kind of not asking questions mutual tolerance that Komin depended on. He had not chosen Vyatskaya Polyani randomly. A 2002 sociological study by the Russian Academy of Sciences examined the relationship between post-Soviet economic contraction and community surveillance behavior in small industrial towns. The study found that in towns experiencing greater than 40% unemployment in the 5 years following 1991, reports of suspicious neighbor behavior to authorities declined by an average of 61% compared to the Soviet-era baseline. The authors attributed this to several factors: distrust of the reconstituted police apparatus, reluctance to create conflict in communities where mutual dependence had increased, and what the study termed attention tunneling, the cognitive narrowing that occurs when material survival demands consume the psychological bandwidth that might otherwise be directed towards civic observation. Komin operated inside that 61%. He maintained the exterior of the property with quiet consistency. The weeds he planted over the hatch were, several neighbors noted at trial, an improvement over the bare dirt that had been there before. He trimmed the hedge along the street side. He kept the gate latched.
He occasionally exchanged remarks with
Neighbors about the weather, the plant, the price of things at the market. He was, as the phrase goes, a good neighbor. Galina F. still lives 2 houses east. She gave a single statement to investigators and has not spoken publicly about the case since. The complaint log entry, number 47, Wednesday afternoon, spring of 1996, was entered into the trial record as Exhibit 23. It is 1 page long. It takes approximately 40 seconds to read aloud. The officer who wrote it and closed it without follow-up was never charged with any crime. He had other things to think about too. The second woman to die in the bunker was 22 years old. Her name was Elena Baikova. She had been traveling to a job interview, a summer position at a textile distribution company in Kirov, when Komin found her at a transit stop near Malmij in the summer of 1996. She had a letter of invitation from the company in her bag. She had ironed her blouse the night before. These details come from her mother's testimony at trial, from what Elena had told her family the morning she left. She arrived at the bunker approximately 14 months after Valentina Sorokina. She arrived when the group's internal dynamics had already calcified around survival, when the rules were known, when the boundaries of what Komin would and would not tolerate had been mapped, in the way the women had mapped the cold in the concrete floor.
She arrived as an outsider
to a system the others had learned to inhabit, and she was, by the testimony of the surviving women, the one who found that inhabitation hardest. She developed an infection in her right hand in the early winter of 1996. The machines in that environment, cold, damp, inadequately maintained, were rough on the hands. Skin cracked, small cuts accumulated. In normal conditions, none of these would have been serious. In the bunker, with no antiseptic, no bandaging, and no medical attention, a small cut on the web of skin between her index and middle finger became infected within a week, and septic within 3. Komin brought aspirin. He noted in his ledger that the aspirin had reduced her output for 2 days. He brought more aspirin.
The infection continued to advance.
He brought a cloth soaked in vodka, which he applied once and did not repeat because the vodka represented a cost he had not budgeted. Per. The 1997 autopsy report on Elena Baikova, conducted following exhumation from the riverbank site, listed septicemia as the primary cause of death, with contributing factors including malnutrition and evidence of blunt force trauma to the upper body, consistent with repeated impact over time. The forensic pathologist who conducted the examination testified that the septicemia was entirely treatable with standard antibiotic intervention available at any regional pharmacy. Cost: approximately 12 rubles at 1996 prices. Komin spent an average of 14 rubles per market day on his own lunch.
The infection that killed Elena Baikova cost less to treat than his soup. Komin dug the second grave in the riverbank, deeper than the first. The soil there was soft clay that held a spade well. He worked efficiently. He had done this before. He placed Elena Baikova beside Ludmila Petrenko, arranged them parallel, covered the disturbed earth with branches from the stand of birch trees along the bank. 2 women from 2 different towns lay side by side in clay soil, and the river ran past them in the dark, and no one along its banks knew they were there. Local fishermen who used that section of the Vyatka later told investigators they had noticed disturbed ground near the birch stand on 2 separate occasions.
One of them had assumed it was animal activity.
Foxes, perhaps, or the root movement of the birch trees themselves. The other said he had noticed it and forgotten about it by the time he reached his car. Neither reported anything. This is not a judgment, it is a fact. The disturbed ground was there to be seen, and it was seen, and the world continued. The shovel went back in the shed that sat above the hatch that sat above the remaining women who did not know, that night, whether they would be the ones brought out next in the dark or the ones still sitting at the machines in the morning. Irina Gusiak made her mark on the wall and counted.
Myth versus reality.
Post-trial commentary suggested that Komin's decision to bury the women near the river, rather than at a greater distance, indicated carelessness or overconfidence. The investigation files suggest a different explanation. Proximity was logistical, not arrogant. Komin did not own a vehicle capable of extended body transport without risk. The riverbank was accessible by foot from the property, in darkness, in under 20 minutes. The soft clay required less labor than alternative sites. His burial decisions, like all his decisions, were cost-benefit calculations. The tragedy is that they were good ones, operationally speaking. The graves were not discovered by search effort.
They were found by accident 18 months later when spring flooding shifted the soil.
He had nearly gotten away with it.
The screw was Phillips' head, 4 millimeters, originally securing the thread tension housing on machine number 3. It had been loose for weeks. Everyone at the benches had felt it, the slight wobble in the housing when the machine ran at full speed, but no one had mentioned it to Komin because loose components were the women's problem, not his, and he docked production for machine downtime. A woman the surviving records identify as Natalia Voronova was the one who removed it. She did this over the course of approximately 20 days, working the screw by fractions of a turn during each shift, tightening it back to near original position before Komin arrived for his evening count, advancing it slightly further each day. This required a level of sustained attention that is remarkable when you consider that she was simultaneously maintaining her production quota to avoid food deductions. She sewed, she counted pieces, she advanced the screw, she recited poetry in her head. The screw was fully extracted on a morning when Komin's schedule had varied. He had left earlier than usual the previous evening and was not expected until midday.
Natalia Voronova had observed his patterns carefully,
The way the women had all observed his patterns, cataloging them in the way you catalog anything your survival depends on. She used the screw on the weakest link of her chain. She had identified it weeks earlier, running her fingers along the entire length of chain in the dark, feeling for the joint where the metal was thinnest, where the manufacturer's casting had been least precise. It was the 4th link from the collar. She had counted to it in the dark so many times that her fingers knew the distance by muscle memory. She worked for approximately 40 minutes. She came within 1 link of open chain before she heard the hatch mechanism engage above her. She did not panic. This is in her testimony. She said she felt something drain out of her, the way air drains from a punctured thing, but she did not make a sound. She pressed the chain link back together with both thumbs as hard as she could, dropped the screw into the gap between her bench slat and the concrete, and was seated at the machine with the housing back in place by the time Komin descended. He noticed nothing that day. He noticed the broken link the following morning. The screw was not found. The link was visible. He inspected all the chains in sequence, running his thumb along each one, as he had done after finding Lyudmila Petrenko's collar marks. He found the link. He replaced the chain with a heavier gauge he had kept in the storage area. Then he applied the punishment, 3 days.
all food withheld from the group.
The woman responsible identified and made to stand. Natalia Voronova did not deny it. By the testimony of the other women, she told Komin it had been her alone, clearly and immediately, so that the collective punishment would not extend beyond what it already was. He added a second lock to every collar that afternoon. He bought the padlocks at a hardware store in Kirov on his next market run, paying cash, the receipt entered in his ledger under security materials. The attempt cost Natalia Voronova 3 days of food and added a second point of restraint to every woman in the bunker. It cost Komin 12 rubles and an afternoon. She was not defeated.
She was a woman who had tried.
Openly, and survived the trying, and who sat back down at the machine afterward and resumed both the sewing and the poetry, one word at a time, in her head, where he could not reach it. Slow. Criminal psychologist Dr. Olga Makushina, who provided expert testimony during the sentencing phase of the 1999 trial, noted that the attempt by Natalia Voronova represented a pattern found consistently in long-term captivity research, what she termed instrumental resistance, distinct from impulsive escape attempts. The planning period, Makushina testified, the deliberate pacing, the decision to self-identify to protect the group, these are markers of intact executive function and preserved social cognition under conditions of extreme stress.
This woman was not psychologically defeated.
She was strategically patient. The difference matters enormously for understanding how survivors of long-term captivity maintain their sense of agency and identity. Natalia Voronova, when asked at trial whether she regretted the attempt, said she regretted only the timing. She believed she would have made it on a different day. The court record notes this. It notes it without comment, in the same typeface as everything else, the way courts record things that are too large for the forms designed to contain them. Myth versus reality. The escape attempt has sometimes been characterized in secondary accounts as reckless, as evidence of a captive who acted without thinking and made conditions worse for everyone.
The trial record contradicts this characterization at every point. The planning duration alone, 20 days of incremental preparation, disqualifies the word reckless. The immediate self-identification to protect others disqualifies it further. What Natalia Voronova conducted was a calculated operation that came within a mechanical fraction of succeeding. That it did not succeed was a matter of timing and the variation in Komin's schedule, not a failure of judgment on her part. She built her tools from what was available. In a 12-meter basement, that was everything. By the first weeks of 1997, the bunker held 3 women. The ledger confirmed it. 5 numbers had reduced to 3 through death, through failed survival, through the arithmetic of confinement that Komin recorded without visible disturbance in the same notebook he had been using for 2 years. 3 numbers, 3 production quotas, 3 daily bread allotments, adjusted downward to reflect the reduction in workforce. He increased the daily quota per woman. The bunker felt different with fewer people in it. This is in the testimony, not described as relief, not described as grief, but as a physical change in the quality of the air, in the sound, in the weight of the silence between machine cycles. 3 women in a 12 by 8 meter space is not the same as 5. The absence of the dead was not an abstraction, it was a dimension.
It was a bench that stayed folded against the wall.
It was a chain coiled on a hook that Komin did not remove, only lifted out of the way, as though the space might be needed again. Irina Gusiak kept marking the wall. Natalia Voronova kept composing poetry. Olga M., the woman whose full name remained sealed in court records at her own request, had developed a practice that she described to investigators as simply watching. She watched the ventilation pipe where light changed slightly between morning and afternoon. She watched the quality of the condensation on the concrete ceiling. She watched the dust that settled on the machine housings overnight and was disturbed in particular patterns by the airflow.
She could tell the time of day within approximately 20 minutes by these observations. She had built a clock from air and concrete and attention. 3 women in a sealed basement had collectively maintained more precise interior records of that space than any external authority had maintained of the man living above them. Komin began checking the door mechanism more frequently in early 1997. This is in the testimony. All 3 women noticed it independently. He had always checked it, but in the early months, the check had been cursory, a pull on the latch, a test of the lower bolt. In the final months before the hatch opened, he descended to check the mechanism at irregular intervals, sometimes twice in a single day, running his hands along the frame, testing the welds. He was checking for something he could not name, some accumulation of pressure he could sense without being able to locate. He spoke less. His evening count visits became shorter. He set the food down and counted pieces and left without the occasional remarks he had made in earlier months, brief, administrative observations about the weather or the market or the thread supply that had never constituted conversation but had at least constituted presence. Then, one night, he brought a radio. It was a portable transistor radio, the kind with a telescoping antenna and a leather carry strap. He set it on a shelf he had installed on the concrete wall, tuned it to a Kirov station that played popular music, and left it running while the women worked the evening shift. He said nothing about it. He did not explain the gesture. He simply put the radio on the shelf and went back upstairs. All 3 women's testimonies mention the radio. Each describes it differently. Natalia Voronova said the music was the most disorienting thing that had happened to her in 2 years. Not the worst, but the most disorienting, because it arrived from outside without warning and brought with it the knowledge that the outside still existed, still played music, still moved through time in the ordinary way.
Irina Gusiak said she touched the thread bracelet on her wrist when the first song started and did not stop touching it until the radio was turned off.
Olga M. said she recognized one of the songs. She did not name it. She said only that she had known it from before. Fact: criminal behavioral analyst Dr. Yuri Antonian, reviewing the case files in 2003, identified the radio as a significant behavioral marker. The introduction of the radio in the final weeks, Antonian wrote, is consistent with a pattern observed in organized offenders who sense the approach of external pressure without being able to identify its source. It is not an act of kindness, it is a stress response. The radio is Komin, telling himself that what he has built is not monstrous. that music exists in it, that normalcy exists in it. He is not trying to improve the conditions of the women. He is trying to improve the conditions of his own perception of what he has done. The radio played for 3 weeks. He was sleeping less. The women could tell by the time of his morning arrivals, earlier and earlier, the sound of the hatch in the dark before what the ventilation pipe's light quality suggested was dawn. He ate less, or brought less food, which amounts to the same result for the women. He sat in his chair against the wall during the evening count and sometimes stared at the machines without counting anything. Something in him knew. He did not know what he knew, or could not let himself know it directly. But the body understands threat before the mind agrees to. His body was preparing for something. The hatch would open in 11 days. He did not open it from below. Myth versus reality. Several accounts of the Komin case suggest that he had been tipped off to the investigation in the days before the raid, and that his behavioral changes reflect a deliberate decision to remain in place long enough to cover evidence before fleeing. The investigation files do not support this interpretation. The behavioral changes documented by the women's testimony begin too early, are too gradual, and are too consistent with the stress response profile to represent calculated concealment. Komin did not know the investigators were coming. He knew something was wrong in the way that a predator knows, through some shift in the air or the pattern of ordinary events, that the territory has changed. He did not know how to name what he felt. He bought a radio and played music, and checked the door more often, and ate less soup, and waited for something he could not see coming to arrive. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, at dawn, with bolt cutters. He had left 8 hours earlier. The radio was still playing when the officers descended. The song it was playing is not noted in the police report. The officer who wrote the report later said he could not remember what it was. He said he remembered turning it off because the sound of it in that room, with the women still at the benches, with the chains still on, was something he could not describe professionally and did not try to. He turned it off. He described the silence that followed as absolute. 3 women looked at the light coming down through the open hatch. One of them asked if it was real. The photograph was small and slightly out of focus, the kind of photograph taken at a family gathering with a camera that nobody owned quite well enough to use. A woman in a summer dress standing in front of a fence, squinting slightly into the sun, holding something, a child's toy, or a cup. The image was not clear enough to determine which, and smiling the particular smile of a person who is at a family gathering and happy about it. Her name was written on the back in pen, Irina. Her mother had carried the photograph to the Vyatskie Polyani police station on a Wednesday in late January 1997. She had been there before. She had filed the missing person report 11 days after Irina Gusiak had not come home, and she had returned twice in the months that followed, and each time she had been told that the case was active, that there were no new developments, that she should continue to check in. She had continued to check in. For 18 months, she had continued to check in. The officer on duty that Wednesday was not the officer who had taken the original report. He was younger, recently transferred from a regional station to Vyatskie Polyani, and he had, unlike the accumulated fatigue that characterized the station's institutional culture around missing persons cases, not yet stopped looking at photographs with his full attention. He looked at the photograph. He looked at it for longer than the moment required. He had seen that face somewhere, not in person, in a file, a separate file, from a different complaint chain. He asked the mother to wait. He went to the filing room. The fiber evidence had been sitting in an evidence bag since autumn of 1996, collected from clothing found near the Vieka River alongside the disturbed ground that later proved to be the first grave. The clothing had been logged, photographed, and placed in the missing persons cross-reference file where it had waited for something to match against. Standard procedure required cross-referencing with outstanding missing person reports. The cross-reference had been initiated and then stalled, waiting for a forensic textile analysis report that had been requested from the regional lab in Kirov and had not arrived. The young officer pulled the fiber file. He looked at the photograph. He made a phone call to the forensic lab in Kirov. The analysis report had been completed and filed 3 months earlier. It had not been forwarded. The case broke not because of sophisticated investigative technique. It broke because one officer knew enough to the job to still look at photographs the way they deserved to be looked at, connected 2 files that had been sitting in the same building for months.
The textile analysis established that fibers recovered from the burial clothing were consistent with commercial leather goods production, a specific thread weight and composition used in industrial leatherwork. The report listed 4 potential manufacturing sources in the Kharov region. The largest 2 were established factories with documented supply chains.
The third was a small registered cooperative outside Malmij. The fourth was listed as unknown small-scale producer, market distribution. The missing persons cross-reference placed Irina Gusiak at a location consistent with Komin's selection pattern. A second cross-reference found Valentina Sorokina in the same geography, same time window, same missing person file status. A third cross-reference, conducted over the following 18 hours as the investigation accelerated, found Natalia Voronova, 3 women, all from within a 30-kilometer radius, all missing within a similar time frame, all cases marked active and stalled. The warrant application was filed the next morning. The forensic textile analysis that broke the Komin case was conducted by a laboratory technician identified in court records as V. Nikolayeva. She had completed the report in October 1996 and submitted it through the standard interdepartmental process. The report sat in a routing queue at the Regional Coordination Office for 3 months due to a filing error. It had been coded under commercial fraud rather than missing persons. This misclassification has never been formally attributed to any individual. The technician who wrote the report gave testimony at trial, confirmed its accuracy, and stated that she had assumed, upon submission, that the appropriate investigating unit had received it. 3 months. The women spent 3 more months in the bunker, while the report that would have found them sat in the wrong filing category. The warrant was approved in the afternoon. Search authority covered the property at 14 Ulica Lenina and any outbuildings or subterranean structures on the parcel. An officer with the warrant unit later noted that the subterranean clause had been added almost as a formality, standard language for property searches. Nobody expected to need it. Officers were scheduled to arrive at dawn. At some point in the preceding 8 hours, Alexander Komin left his house. He packed a bag. He did not take his ledgers. They were found in their customary place under his bed. The notebook for the current month still open to the last entry. He did not take the list of family addresses, which was found in his jacket pocket at arrest, suggesting he had intended to use it before he was overtaken by whatever combination of instinct and information caused him to move. He took the one-way ticket to Moscow that he had purchased, records show, 4 days earlier. He had bought the ticket 4 days before the warrant was filed. His body had known before anyone else did that the territory had changed. He walked to the bus station. He left the radio playing. He left 3 women at the machines. He left the hatch locked. Myths versus reality. Post-arrest analysis of Komin's timeline briefly raised the possibility that he had a source within the police station who had warned him. Investigation found no evidence of this. The 4-day window between ticket purchase and warrant filing, and the 8-hour window between warrant filing and property arrival, are consistent with Komin's established pattern of periodic travel planning and do not indicate foreknowledge. The most parsimonious explanation, supported by the behavioral record, is that a man who had lived with increasing anxiety for weeks finally made the decision to move when the accumulated pressure exceeded his capacity for inaction. The trigger was internal, not external. He ran because he was already running. He had been running inside his own mind for months. He just finally moved his feet. Dawn in Vyatskia Polyani in February is a particular kind of cold. Not dramatic cold, not the operatic cold of open steppe or northern wilderness, but the close, damp cold of a small industrial town in river country, where the moisture from the Vyatka settles into the streets overnight and the morning air carries the smell of frozen mud and coal smoke and the particular diesel quality of vehicles left to run idle while their drivers wait for heat. The officers arrived at 14 Ulica Lenina at 0620. They came in 2 vehicles, 6 officers. One had the bolt cutters, one had the warrant. The others had whatever they carried to the doors of properties they had been told might contain hidden structures and unknown numbers of persons. The yard was quiet. The shed door was padlocked on the outside. They moved to the shed first, based on the property map included in the warrant application. The map had been drawn from satellite imagery and a neighbor's description, not Galina F's complaint, which remained uncorrelated,
of what the structure looked like from the adjacent property. The bolt cutters took 40 seconds on the padlock. The shed smelled of old wood and garden equipment and nothing else. A reasonable person entering that shed without context would have seen nothing. Tools on hooks, a folded tarp, a chest of drawers that had been repurposed for small hardware storage. And then, beneath the chest of drawers, when the lead officer moved it aside, a metal plate, set flush with the wooden floor over a concrete recess. A second padlock,
A handle welded to the plate's edge.
The bolt cutters took longer on the second padlock, 45 seconds, a minute. The sound of the cutters on the lock was the loudest sound in the shed. The lead officer later gave a statement describing what happened next in precise administrative language, the language of a man who understood that the document he was producing would be read in court, who chose each word with the care of someone who has seen something and is trying to report it with fidelity rather than feeling. He said the plate was lifted. He said a ladder was visible below. He said he descended. Between the lifting of the plate and the descent he mentioned, in the same even language, two things, the smell and the sound. The smell reached them before they were halfway down the ladder. It was the smell of a sealed space inhabited by people without adequate sanitation or ventilation for an extended period. It was a smell, the officer wrote, that he recognized from the kind of scenes he hoped not to respond to again. The sound was the machines. They were still running, 3 women still at their benches at 0620 on a February morning, still sewing, still meeting the quota, because the quota had not been lifted and they had not been told it was over, and they had learned, over 2 years and 4 months, that the correct response to an opening hatch was to continue working until told otherwise. One of the officers descended after the lead officer. A third waited at the top of the ladder. The remaining 3 held the perimeter outside. Inside the bunker, 3 women at 3 machines, a single bulb on a wire, concrete walls with condensation on the upper sections, mattresses against the far wall, a bucket in the corner, the smell of machine oil and closed air and human occupancy, the calendar scratched into the concrete behind the furthest mattress, small, precise marks in groups of 5, more than 700 of them, covering an area the size of a school notebook. The machine stopped when the women saw the officers. The silence that followed was, by the officer's account, the most significant silence he had encountered in his professional life. He wrote that he did not know how to characterize it, except to say that it was not the silence of an empty space. It was the silence of people hearing something end. One of the women asked if the light was real. The question was directed at the daylight coming down through the open hatch, the first natural light any of them had seen in months. It was the pale, gray-blue light of a February dawn in river country, barely light at all by most measurements, diffused through cloud cover and filtered further by the angle of the shaft. She asked if it was real. No one answered her for several minutes. This is in the lead officer's statement. He writes that he did not answer because he did not know how to answer, not because he was uncertain of the answer, but because he could not find language adequate to the question being asked. She was not asking about physics. She was asking whether the thing she had spent 2 years and 4 months believing would eventually happen had actually happened. Eventually, one of the officers said yes. The light is real. It is morning. You are safe. Irina Gusiak touched the thread bracelet on her wrist. She stood up from the bench. She asked about her daughter. The chains were cut by the second officer, while the lead officer maintained communication with the station. Medical units arrived at 0708. The women were brought up through the hatch one at a time. The February morning received them one at a time. Valentina Sorokina, when she emerged from the hatch, stood in the cold yard and looked at the sky for what witnesses described as a long time, long enough that an officer moved toward her, concerned, before realizing she was simply standing and looking at the sky, and that this required no intervention. She had not seen the sky in 2 years and 4 months. She looked at it the way you look at something you were afraid you had invented, checking it against the memory, verifying that it matches, verifying that the memory was accurate, that the blue-gray of a February sky in Vyatskie Polyany is what it was, and not something the mind constructs to survive the absence of it. It was what it was. She confirmed it. She looked at it for a long time. Fact. Medical evaluation conducted at Kirov Regional Hospital in the days following rescue documented the physical condition of the 3 surviving women. significant muscle atrophy consistent with limited movement range over an extended period, vitamin D deficiency consistent with absence of sunlight exposure, dental deterioration consistent with nutritional deficit, skin conditions consistent with prolonged contact with cold concrete surfaces, and in 2 of the 3 women, hearing loss in the frequency range consistent with prolonged exposure to the specific pitch of the sewing machine motors they had operated. Their bodies carried a record of exactly what had been done to them, written in bone and tissue and hearing range. The machines had marked them as precisely as Irina Gusiak had marked the wall. The calendar behind the mattress was photographed, documented, and entered into evidence as Exhibit 7. It was the most precise record of captivity duration in the case file, more precise than anything in Komin's ledgers. Myth versus reality. Media coverage in the weeks following the discovery described the women as emerging barely alive. The medical record is more precise and more respectful of the truth. All 3 were malnourished and physically diminished, but all 3 were conscious, oriented, and communicative from the moment of rescue. Natalia Voronova, during her initial medical evaluation, asked the attending physician for paper and a pen. She said she wanted to write something down before she forgot it. The physician provided them. The attending physician's notes record that she wrote for approximately 20 minutes without stopping. She was writing down the poems. The Kirov bus station at 8 in the morning is an ordinary place. Linoleum floors worn pale at the center of the traffic lanes. A kiosk selling cigarettes and newspapers and hard candies in a glass case. The smell of diesel from the bays outside, and something that might be coffee from a thermos on the kiosk counter. Departure boards with hand-set letters. Travelers who look like travelers everywhere, holding bags, consulting tickets, watching the boards with the mild, preoccupied expression of people managing a transition between one place and another. Alexander Komin arrived at the Kirov bus station at approximately 7:45 in the morning. He had been on a regional bus from Vyatskia Polyani for the preceding 2 hours. He was carrying one bag. He was wearing his plant jacket. He sat in a row of plastic seats near the departure board and held his Moscow ticket in his hands. He had been sitting there for approximately 40 minutes when 2 officers from the Kirov city station, acting on a description transmitted from Vyatskia Polyani following the hatch opening, entered the station at 0827. They identified him from across the room. He did not run. He did not stand up. He watched the officers walk toward him, and he sat in his plastic chair and held his ticket and waited for them to arrive. One officer took the bag. The other took the ticket. A third officer, who had entered through a side door, stood behind him. Komin offered no resistance. This is in the arrest report, filed at 0831. The entry reads, "Subject compliant. No resistance, no statements made at time of detention." He made one statement during transport. He asked whether the women were still alive. The officer who received this question, a Kirov city officer identified in the transport report by badge number, gave a statement to investigators 3 weeks later describing the moment. He said the question had been asked quietly, without what he could characterize as emotion. He said it had not seemed to him, in the moment, like a question being asked out of concern. He said it had seemed like a question being asked by a man performing an accounting, determining the scope of what remained, the resources still present. The officer said he had told Komin that the women were alive and receiving medical care. Komin had nodded. He said nothing further for the remainder of the transport. In his jacket pocket, a folded list, handwritten in the same careful script as the ledgers. Names, addresses, telephone numbers where available. The relatives of every woman who had been in the bunker, the mother, the sister, the brother who had lived with Lyudmila Petrenko, the 9-year-old daughter's grandmother. The list was photographed and entered into evidence as Exhibit 31. The prosecution used it to argue that Komin had maintained the threat against families as an operational tool, that the list was not a coincidental accumulation of information, but a managed resource, updated and carried on his person during the period when he anticipated needing it most. The defense argued that the list was evidence of Komin's intention to alert the families himself that he had been planning to make contact to ensure the women's safe release. The court considered both arguments. The court considered also the 2 graves in the riverbank clay, the welded hatch, the chains, the ledger entry that read, "Closed." At the Kirov city station, Komin was processed and placed in a holding cell. He ate the meal that was brought to him.
He asked for a pen but was not given one. He slept, by the guard's report, without difficulty. A Czechmary and FAT criminologist, Alexander Bukanovsky, who had previously worked on the Chikatilo case and who reviewed the Komin arrest file at the prosecution's request, wrote in his 1999 case analysis, "The absence of flight, Komin had the ticket, had the opportunity, had an 8-hour window in which no officer was looking for him, is the detail that most illuminates his psychological structure. He bought the ticket, he packed the bag.
He got on the bus to Kirov, and then he sat in the station and waited."
This is not indecision. This is a man who did not fully believe in the reality of his own ending. He had been the only authority in his world for 2 years. The concept that the world could impose authority on him had not been integrated into his functional model of reality. He bought a ticket to Moscow the same way he bought aspirin for a dying woman, as a gesture toward management of a problem, without full engagement with whether the gesture was adequate. He had bought the ticket. He had not gotten on the train. He was 43 years old, sitting in a plastic chair in a bus station, holding a ticket to a city he would never reach, and it is possible that some part of him had always known this was where it ended. Not in Moscow, not in flight, but in an ordinary linoleum room with departure boards and a thermos of coffee, waiting for what was already inevitable to arrive and take the ticket out of his hands. Investigators returned to 14 Ulitsa Lenina that afternoon and conducted the full property search. They found the ledgers under the bed. They found the sales receipts in the tin box. They found the thread inventory, the tool logs, the chain purchase records, the security materials entry for the padlocks he had bought after Natalia Voranova's escape attempt. They found, in the storage area adjacent to the bunker, a length of unused chain of the same gauge as the replacements he had installed. He had bought enough for more. Myth versus reality. Reports circulating in the years following the trial suggested that Komin had confessed fully and cooperated extensively with investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence consideration. The court record does not support this. Komin gave detailed statements about the operation of the bunker, the construction, the sourcing of captives, the market distribution system, but consistently maintained throughout the investigation and at trial that the arrangement had been consensual. He described it as a business.
He did not describe the chains,
The welded hatch, the withheld food, or the graves as inconsistent with this characterization. He explained each element in operational terms. The chains were to prevent loss of workers. The hatch was for security. The food rationing was standard labor management. The graves were a practical solution to an operational problem. He was not performing innocence. He believed the framing he was offering. This is the detail that the forensic psychiatrists found most significant and most disturbing. He thought he had been running a business. The trial of Alexander Nikolayevich Komin opened at the Kirov Regional Court on March 14, 1999. Case number 2-147-99.
The courtroom was standard Soviet institutional architecture.
High ceilings, pale walls, wooden dock, fluorescent lighting that hummed at a frequency low enough to ignore until you had been sitting under it for several hours, at which point it became precisely the kind of ambient presence that prevents rest. Komin was 45 years old by the time of trial. He had spent 2 years in pretrial detention. He appeared by the photographs entered into the court archive and by press accounts from observers present, essentially unchanged, the same medium height, the same unremarkable face, the same quality of forgettable presence that had allowed him to operate at markets for 2 years without any vendor or customer finding him worth remembering afterward. He wore a suit to trial. He had pressed it himself, according to the detention facility staff report. He sat in the dock and listened to the charges read. The prosecution was led by senior prosecutor Mikhail Vorobev, who had spent the preceding 18 months building a case from the ledgers, the receipts, the textile analysis, the graves, the chains, and the testimony of 3 women who had sat in a basement for 2 years and come out the other side with enough precise memory to reconstruct every detail of what had been done to them. Vorobev opened with the calendar. He read the number of marks into the record. He asked the court to understand what that number represented in human time, not as an abstraction, but as a quantity of mornings, of evenings, of machine cycles, of bread allocations, of locked doors. 700 and more mornings in a concrete room. He read it slowly. He let the courtroom sit with it. Komin watched him read it and showed, by all available accounts, no particular expression. Thus, the prosecution presented 218 individual pieces of evidence. Among these, the ledger, 47 market receipts, the textile analysis report, the collar and chain from bench number 3, the chain with the broken link from Natalia Voronova's escape attempt, the second gauge replacement chains, the autopsy reports from the 2 exhumed bodies, Komin's sales receipt books under both aliases, the property search photographs, and the list of family addresses found in his jacket pocket at arrest. The chains were displayed on a table in front of the dock throughout the trial. They remained on that table for 16 days. Komin could see them from where he sat. He took the stand. This is the detail that distinguished the Komin trial in the literature on organized captivity cases, that he chose to testify voluntarily at length in his own defense. His testimony lasted 3 days. He described the bunker as a business arrangement. He described the women as employees who had agreed to the terms of employment, including accommodation. He described the chains as a security measure necessitated by initial instances of what he called unauthorized absence. He described the food rationing as standard incentive-based compensation. He described the deaths as regrettable outcomes of pre-existing health conditions. He was asked about the welded hatch. He said the hatch was welded for structural integrity. He was asked about the pistol that Valentina Sorokina and Irina Gusiak had described in their testimony. He said he had carried a pistol for personal security during market runs, as was common in the region at the time. He was asked about the list of family addresses. He said he had compiled it in case of emergency contact necessity. He had an answer for everything. Every answer was wrong, and he believed every one of them. The forensic psychiatrist appointed by the court, Dr. Irina Semyonova, a specialist in personality disorder assessment from the Moscow Serbsky Center, testified during the sentencing phase. Her report, submitted to the court and partially available through the appeals record, described Komin as demonstrating a severe narcissistic personality structure with what she characterized as systematic moral inversion, a framework in which his own convenience and operational requirements constituted the primary ethical reference point, and in which the experiences and suffering of other people registered only insofar as they affected his operational outcomes. She testified that Komin was not, in the clinical sense, delusional. He was not psychotic. He understood reality accurately in all domains that affected his functioning. What he lacked, she said, was the capacity to experience the moral weight of his actions as the action's primary characteristic. He experienced them as logistics. He had always experienced them as logistics. The question this court must consider, Dr. Semyonova said, is not whether this man knew what he was doing. He knew precisely what he was doing. The question is whether knowing, in the cognitive sense, constitutes understanding in the human sense. My assessment is that for this individual, those two things were never connected. They operated in separate rooms, and the door between them was never open. The survivors testified. Valentina Sorokina testified for 4 hours. Natalia Voronova testified for 3 hours and 20 minutes. Olga M., whose identity remained sealed, testified behind a screen for 2 hours. Irina Gusiak testified for 6 hours across 2 days. During Irina Gusiak's testimony, Komin took notes. His attorney later said these were factual corrections he intended to relay, instances where her account differed from his own recollection of operational details. He was correcting her account of her captivity. He corrected the record of his own crimes, the way an accountant corrects a ledger error, for accuracy, for completeness, because the numbers matter and the numbers should be right. The court sentenced Alexander Nikolayevich Komin to life imprisonment on March 31, 1999. The sentencing decision cited deprivation of liberty, forced labor, 2 counts of murder, and what the court classified as systematic torture through prolonged controlled confinement. The decision was unanimous. The deliberation took 4 hours. Komin received the sentence without visible reaction. He was returned to the holding cell. He ate dinner. He slept. The detention facility staff report notes, without comment, that he slept well. He died in Corrective Colony IK5, Kirov Oblast, on February 8, 2013. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest. He was 59 years old. The prison medical log notes no unusual health events in the preceding week. He
He died in the institution the way people die in institutions, in a room, in the night, without particular drama.
Pause. Myth versus reality.
Following Komin's death, several online sources circulated claims that he had made a deathbed statement, a confession of additional crimes, or alternatively, a final assertion of his business arrangement defense. The Federal Penitentiary Service death record and the prison medical log contain no reference to any final statement. The medical officer who certified his death gave a brief statement to regional press indicating that Komin had been in routine health and had died without any unusual last words or requests. He died as he had lived, without drama, without visible remorse, without the theatrical ending that the magnitude of what he had done seems to demand. He simply stopped. The Kirov Regional Court's 1999 sentencing decision in case number 15-2147/99 included a directive that the property at 14 Ulitsa Lenina be evaluated for demolition. The evaluation was conducted. The recommendation was to seal the bunker rather than demolish the structure, citing cost. The bunker entrance was filled with concrete in the autumn of 1999. The shed remains standing. The property changed hands twice between 2000 and the date of last available record. Current occupancy status is not publicly documented. The concrete poured to fill the hatch contains, beneath it, the shelf where Komin placed the radio, the bolt where Natalia Voronova's chain was anchored, the marks Irina Guyok made on the wall, 700 marks in groups of 5, filled with concrete, buried under a shed in Vyatskia Polyani that strangers now pass without looking at.
Conclusion.
The bunker is still there, not open, sealed, filled, covered, but there. The concrete they poured in the autumn of 1999 did not erase it. It preserved it, the way concrete preserves everything it encloses. The chain bolt, the ventilation pipe stub, the scratch marks on the wall, the nail that Irina Gusiak used to mark time in a room that a town of 30,000 people lived above without knowing. The women recovered. This is the fact that matters most, and the one that gets the least space in the files. Valentina Sorokina received medical treatment and new identification documents and, eventually, a different life in a town whose name does not appear in the record at her request.
Irina Gusiak was
Reunited with her daughter Masha, who was 11 years old by then. Natalia Voronova submitted her poems to a literary journal in 2001. The journal accepted 3. Olga M. is listed in the closed file, her outcome sealed behind her own name. They were 4 women who walked into a van or a car on ordinary days and spent more than 2 years underground. And they survived it, each in her own way, and they came back. The list of family addresses found in Komin's jacket pocket at arrest was analyzed by investigators for 8 months. No additional captives were found. No additional properties were identified. Whether the list represented an intention to expand operations, a tool of continued control during flight, or something else the investigators could not categorize, the file does not settle the question. It leaves it open. Some questions stay open. Alexander Komin was not a monster in any useful sense of that word. Monsters are useful to us because they are separate, because their monstrousness is a category that excludes the ordinary world, that places their actions outside what ordinary life can produce. Komin was not outside ordinary life. He lived inside it, paid his bills inside it, ate soup at the market inside it, nodded to his neighbors inside it, and built a basement underneath it where he kept women chained to machines.
He did this inside ordinary life,
using its textures and habits and indifferences as cover, as load-bearing structure, as the medium through which everything he did was made possible. The ordinary life was not separate from what he built under it. The ordinary life was how he built it. Dr. Alexander Bukhanovsky, reflecting on the case in his 2001 analysis, wrote a single sentence that the prosecution quoted during closing arguments and that appears underlined in the copies of the document held in the court archive. The most dangerous thing a predatory individual can do is become unremarkable. Komin became unremarkable. The town let him. Galina F.
heard voices in the night,
and walked to the police station and told someone. And the record shows that she told someone. And the record also shows what the telling cost her in terms of outcome, which was nothing, which was the complaint logged and closed and forgotten, which was 12 more months of silence from the hatch. She tried. The system was not built to receive what she was trying to give it. This is a distinction that matters. Individual failure is manageable. Systemic failure is the condition that makes the next Alexander Komin possible.
It is being made possible right now.
In underfunded stations and misfiled reports and complaints logged and closed without follow-up. In every jurisdiction where the machinery of response has been allowed to degrade below the threshold required to respond. The Komin case is not a historical artifact, it is a diagnostic. Irina Gusiak's calendar is in a closed evidence archive in Kirov. 723 marks, by the final count, in groups of 5. She has never publicly discussed whether she went back to look at it after the trial. She has given no interviews since 2000. Her case file is marked, ongoing welfare monitoring, no active concerns. She is out there somewhere, living a life whose details belong entirely to her. She counted every day she was underground.
She made sure someone would know exactly how long it had lasted.
That is the kind of evidence that does not go into a ledger. That is the kind of evidence that a man like Komin could not have anticipated, because it required a kind of care for the record that he was constitutionally incapable of understanding. She marked the wall, she survived, she walked up the ladder into a February morning and looked at the sky. That is what this file contains, at its center, a woman who counted the days and kept going. Every case in Archive 13 contains something like this, a person who kept going, who kept count, who left a record in whatever medium was available. Concrete, thread, memory, poems written down before they could be forgotten. We opened these files for them.
What did Komin intend to do with the list of family addresses found in his pocket?
This is not a rhetorical question. We do not know the answer. The file does not contain it. We are asking because the question belongs in the open, where it can be looked at, because the alternative is to fold it into the concrete with everything else and let the weeds grow over it. Cold cases, true records, nothing buried. Subscribe to Archive 13 and tell us in the comments which case we should open next. Every file in this archive is real. Every name was a person. If this record matters to you, leave a mark. It is the least any of us can do. Sources and references. Ministry of Internal Affairs of the Russian Federation, 1999. Trial transcript of Alexander Komin, case number
22147/99.
Kirov Regional Court, Federal Security Service Archive, 1997. Search warrant and property inspection report, 14 Ulitsa Lenina, Vyatskia Polyani, Kirov Oblast. Kirov Oblast Prosecutor's Office, 1998. Autopsy reports, remains of Ludmila Petrenko and Elena Bivakov, recovered from Vyatka River Burial Site, Forensic Pathology Division, Bukhanovsky, Alexander, 2001. Serial Predation and Organized Captivity in Post-Soviet Rural Zones. Journal of Forensic Psychiatry, Volume 12, Number 3, People 9, 44-67. Semyonova, Irina, 1999. Forensic Psychiatric Evaluation, Alexander Nikolayevich Komin. Submitted to Kirov Regional Court, case number 2147/99. Moscow Serbsky Center for Social and Forensic Psychiatry. Antonyan, Yuri, 2003. Coercive Labor Systems in Post-Soviet Transitional States. Behavioral and Structural Analysis. Institute of Criminology, Moscow State University. Research Publication Series Number 7. Human Rights Watch, 2000. Hidden Confinement and Forced Labor Cases in the Russian Federation, 1993 to 1999. HRW Publications, New York. Novaya Gazeta, 1999. Basement labor camp uncovered in Kirov region. Investigative report by staff correspondent, published April 2, 1999. Masyuk Elena, 2000. Voices from the Bunker. Interviews with survivors of the Polyani captivity. Independent Media Archive, Moscow. Russian Academy of Sciences, Sociological Studies Division, 2002. Civic Surveillance Behavior and Community Reporting Rates in Post-Soviet Small Industrial Towns, 1991 to 2001. Sociological Studies Quarterly, Volume
18, Issue 2.
Kirov Regional Court, 1999. Sentencing Decision, Case Number 2147/99. Alexander Nikolayevich Komin, March 31, 1999. Federal Penitentiary Service of the Russian Federation, 2013. Death Certificate and Medical Log.
inmate Alexander Nikolayevich Komin, Corrective Colony IK5, Kirov Oblast, Missing Persons Registry of the Russian Federation, 1995 to 1997, Case Files, Valentina Sorokina, Irina Gusiak, Natalia Voronova, Elena Baikova, Vyetskaya Polyany District Station Records, Portova, Anna, 2001, The Provider Lure, Economic Vulnerability and Abduction Method Selection in Organized Captivity Cases, Journal of Forensic Psychiatry, Volume 12, Number 4, Prepes 88 to 101, Makushina, Olga, 1999. Expert testimony on instrumental resistance and agency preservation under long-term captivity conditions, submitted to Kirov Regional Court, case number 214799, sentencing phase, AGF, Victor, 1997-1999, witness statement compilation and investigation summary, Kirov Police Department case files, reference number KPD 1997-0341.